Hello everyone. The closed beta for Warhammer 40k Darktide has recently ended and I played it a ton over the weekend that it was available. I actually had quite a few things I wanted to talk about, so I said screw it, let's make it into a video. So here we are. I really enjoyed my time during the beta, but there are a few things that held it back a bit, so let's talk about it. First, I want to preface this by stating that this is a beta test of a likely older build of the game, and not all the planned features were available. There was no extra gear to equip besides weapons, no crafting, and there was a limited weapon selection. This doesn't mean we can't provide criticism and feedback, but that it's good to know that we weren't able to test all the components of the game. I want to start with one of the biggest topics first, game performance. The technical side of the game was a bit rough. On my RX 6700 XT GPU and my Ryzen 5 5600X CPU, I would at worst get frame rates as low as 40 to 50 during heavy combat in certain areas on medium to high settings. The game does support AMD FSR and NVIDIA DLSS, I'm pretty sure, and that seemed to improve performance in my experience, but the visual quality took a hit as a result. I didn't spend too much time adjusting the FSR settings, so perhaps there's a good combination of settings that would improve performance without the hit to visual fidelity. I'm pretty confident that one of the goals of this beta was for Fatshark to get feedback on performance from a wide range of machines. The beta test was not just a chance for us to try the game out, but for Fatshark to get some results on the technical side of the game as well. I would like to think that they knew performance was not great, but now with all these players trying the game, they hopefully have a better idea of how to improve game performance for the full launch. I don't expect it to be perfect when it's fully released, but I do hope for major improvements. There was also some settings missing from the beta, most noticeably a lack of mouse sensitivity options. I was able to get used to it, but it was an odd thing to exclude. There was also an annoying bug that would reset all the keybinds when the game restarted. Luckily, these are already going to be fixed for the full release as confirmed by one of the community managers on the Darktide Discord. With that out of the way, let's move on to the actual content of the beta. In contrast to Fatshark's other titles, Vermintide 1 and Vermintide 2, Darktide lets you create your own character this time around instead of having to select between preset characters. When making your character, you will select your class, and at launch will have the Zealot, Ogryn, Psyker, and the Veteran. But there are also choices regarding your character's backstory, such as where they were born, how they were raised, an important life event, and so on. There were only a few choices for each, but it seems like depending on your backstory, it can change the banter between the characters when going on missions, which I think is a cool addition. The character creator is nothing too special, especially since it had fairly limited options, but in other preview screenshots, we've seen a lot more options in the character creator, so I'm hopeful the full release will have more freedom. I think I'm in the minority in that I actually like being able to make my own character instead of having to select from the 5 established characters in Vermintide. I generally get more invested with the game if I'm able to flesh out my character rather than having to be forced into specific character choices. The banter that plays within missions is not as personal as the stuff we've heard in Vermintide, but there seems to be a lot more variety with the dialogue this time around, which helps cut down on having to hear the same voice lines constantly, which is a problem I had when playing Vermintide. This also removes any class restrictions when playing missions. This was an odd but understandable quirk with Vermintide since those games had 5 established characters, and it wouldn't make much sense if you could roll with a full team of the exact same character. But now in Vermintide, we are free to play missions with any combination of classes now, which is a big bonus personally. Next up, the Morning Star is the new hub area in Darktide, and visually I love this area. In fact, I love all the environmental details present not just in the hub, but during missions also. I'm not well versed on Warhammer 40k, but I have to imagine this is pretty close to what it would look like to be in one of those mega hive cities. The aesthetic of the entire game is totally on point, and I can't get over the details of the world. You look out in some areas and see giant cathedrals and other grand architecture. It's amazing stuff, and I love it. During my early missions, I would often just look around and see a bunch of little details to help spruce up the world. I've heard some complaints about the missions in the beta not feeling as distinct as missions in Vermintide, and while I agree somewhat, these missions are pretty much exactly what I expected, and I'm totally okay with that. They fit the theme of the game perfectly. Maybe I'm on some copium, but I'm hoping they're saving the more extravagant missions for the full launch. In the beta, there were 2 vendors we could interact with. There is a contract vendor that had weekly challenges to complete for a specific currency that could be used to buy higher level weapons, and a general merchant that sold items for gold. Like I mentioned at the start, we did not have access to any crafting available in this beta build. I imagine it's pretty similar to how Vermintide handled crafting, where you can upgrade items at higher rarities and reroll stats on them. I might be in the minority here, but I think I actually prefer these systems compared to the random chests that you would open after each mission in Vermintide. But without being able to test fully how gear progression works, I can't really say if it's an improvement or not. One of the strangest aspects was the UI. Now, the display during missions is alright. Nothing fancy, but it's functional. The main problem I have is with the weapon stats and the weapon info screen. Tell me, Fat Shark, what do these bars mean? What do any of these stats do exactly? What is collateral and penetration? And what's the difference between these stats? I could make a guess, but I wouldn't be able to tell if it's right. If I inspect a weapon individually, there are icons indicating a couple of combos, but it doesn't tell me what those icons are. Again, I could guess and infer what they mean based on my experience with the gameplay, but I shouldn't have to guess. And that's the real point I'm trying to make here. There's nothing in the game that explains how any of this works. No pop-ups, no mouse over for additional information, just nothing. I'm honestly not too bothered about all of this, especially when compared to other posts I've seen online, but it's still a bit sloppy. I'm not a Vermintide veteran, but from my limited understanding, it starts to get really messy once you try to understand what the stats on weapons actually do and how they interact with certain types of enemies. I could look past this if I could at least compare two weapons that are the exact same type, but as far as I'm aware, that is not something we could do either. Somewhat related to this as well, but there was not any kind of testing area during the beta also. I'm really hoping there is somewhere we can go to try out weapons in the full game without having to play an entire mission. I don't entirely hate this, but it's a weird backstep compared to Vermintide 2, which had target dummies in the hub. Hopefully it's just a beta thing and that there is a testing area in the full game. Now, I've been a bit negative so far, but I wanted to save my favorite part for last. I think it's time to move on to the real star of the game, the combat. And my god, this game is just so fun and satisfying. I could go on and on about this, but Fat Shark has proved once again that they know how to nail visceral first-person combat. Slashing and smacking your weapons through a horde of poxwalkers is immensely satisfying, and I'll never get tired of it. The class I played for most of the beta was the Zealot, though I also played the Psyker for a bit. The Zealot's main ability is a charge, which helped in closing the distance on a group of ranged enemies, or being able to disrupt a pack by charging into them so I can block, push, and kill them. Darktide is also boasting a slew of ranged weapons this time around. Vermintide had its fair share of ranged weapons, but it was nothing more than bows, spears, and basic rifles, with some exceptions like Sienna that had magic-based weapons. In Darktide, we've got las guns, auto rifles, combat shotguns, revolvers, and some class-specific weapons like the Force Staff for the Psykers, which essentially lets them cast AoE spells on the ground. When playing, it's pretty obvious that it's supposed to be a bit of an even split between melee and ranged combat, and I think it flows really well. The ranged weaponry was just as satisfying as the melee combat, and I couldn't be happier. We only had a handful of weapons to play with in the beta, but what I've played with so far has felt really satisfying. If you look in the background footage as well, you can probably see everything I'm talking about so far. Even if I have some gripes with some of the other systems in the game, the gameplay is the biggest pull for me to keep playing, and I'm glad Fat Shark pulled through yet again in that department. I really can't emphasize enough how much fun the gameplay felt to me. I almost finished writing the script without mentioning the soundtrack, and I'm glad I remembered because it's also really good. There's good ambient tracks from when you're traveling in missions, but when the action picks up, so does the music. The gameplay and the music mesh really well together, and in my time playing the game, I caught myself bopping my head to the soundtrack as I was fighting through hordes and killing bosses. The closed beta definitely wasn't perfect, and there are some long-term issues that I think are valid concerns, but I really want to reiterate that I personally really enjoyed my time at the beta, and has made me excited for a possible open beta, and of course, the full release. For some, the issues present in the beta might be enough to convince you to hold off from playing at launch, and I think that's totally valid. You know, there's a lot of issues with the game, and I think a lot of veteran Vermintide players are looking at this thinking, is this really the sequel to Vermintide 2? Possibly not. But if you're looking for a pretty solid co-op FPS horde shooter that's set in the 40k universe, I think you're going to have a great time. And that about wraps it up for me. If you've made it this far, I appreciate you listening to me ramble on about my opinion on things. I've wanted to make content like this for a while, and I sort of realized that I should at least try making something instead of continuously saying, oh yeah, I want to do it, but then I never actually do anything. So thanks again for watching. Follow me on Twitter, twitch.tv, like and subscribe on YouTube, all that jazz. You all know how that goes. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thanks.